afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. One of the few drawbacks to summer in Vermont is the bugs. Bugs that bite are the worst and the most dangerous. So our focus today is on ticks and mosquitoes. We've called on the state expert who studies these critters that bite, burrow, or sting. I want to welcome Alan Graham. Alan is the state entomologist with the Agency of Agriculture. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me, Judy.
Let's first talk about mosquitoes because your work was in the news at the end of July. 3 mosquito pools collected in Springfield tested positive for West Nile virus. It's a scary headline, but what does it really mean to you or me or our families?
Okay, well, a mosquito pool is actually a batch of mosquitoes. We test species of mosquitoes, individual species, and we pile them together in little piles of the same species from the same trap at the same time. And this batch of mosquitoes is called a pool. Mm-hmm. We are seeing a lot of mosquitoes from the frequent rains that we have. These are mosquitoes that form in puddles and bird baths. And so we've been testing these, and 3 batches of mosquitoes from the same site tested positive. This means that we're seeing the virus, and it's not unusual to see the virus at this time of year. We expect that we will see the virus in August and September. This is the 2 months of the year where it's more likely to find virus activity. And what we're doing is we're keeping a careful eye on what's going on with the populations. And it's an indirect way to measure the virus activity in the bird population. That's where the West Nile virus is currently found. Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned that birds over the years have actually built up sort of an immunity to West Nile.
Right. When the virus first came to North America, birds were dying quite rapidly. And I think some in Vermont here may recall when the Department of Health was looking for people to call in with reports of dead birds. Mm-hmm. Now these birds have developed an immunity, and they also perhaps have become a dispersion mechanism. We saw the virus leave New York and then begin to show up in Florida. And then from the migratory routes there, it started moving slowly westward.
Interesting. And so what can we do to prevent getting West Nile virus?
Well, we caution people, use personal protection, and that's the best thing you could do. The CDC website has excellent information about various repellents you can use, and mm-hmm. pick one that is effective and one that works for you.
And you also have some more advice about clothing too?
Wear long sleeve clothing,
mm-hmm.
Long pants if you're out at night, and just be aware that August and September, not just in Vermont but throughout New England, are the months where we can see this virus activity.
So you also test for another mosquito-borne disease, Eastern Equine Encephalitis, or EEE. Any positive tests yet for that?
We haven't found any mosquito batches testing positive for triple E virus. Mm-hmm. Eastern equine encephalitis virus is also present in Vermont. It's relatively new. We've been looking for it for quite a while. However, it perhaps has been here, but it's just very hard to detect. Our season generally is shorter than other parts of the country, so it shows up a little bit later than Massachusetts, and when we start getting cold in October, it begins to disappear.
And so equine encephalitis, does that mean it just affects horses?
That means it was first seen as a disease that affected horses. Mm-hmm. It's believed in Massachusetts in the mid-1800s, early 1800s, a large number of horses died, and this is believed to have been due to Eastern equine encephalitis.
But it can affect other animals as well.
It does affect other animals, and it affects humans. And we're considered to be hosts where the virus can't survive that well. And we don't, it affects us health-wise, but the virus can't replicate in us. But it normally circulates in the bird population, so we monitor mosquitoes that feed primarily on birds.
Interesting. Your work also involves surveying for ticks in Vermont. How does this summer rate in terms of the number of ticks that you're finding? Well,
in summertime, we generally don't find deer ticks. The end of the deer tick season is in June. But the tick season continued because I started getting an unusual number of ticks coming in that were actually dog ticks. And so this has been a very good year for dog ticks. And they're slightly different, they're slightly larger, and they have a little ornate pattern on the back. I'll show a slide later.
Okay. So how many kinds of ticks are there in Vermont?
We have 13 different types of ticks in Vermont.
Really?
Most of them been here. Here's a slide showing all the ticks we have. Most of these ticks would be pretty hard to find. The ones that are most common would be, right now, the deer tick, or black-legged tick, and the dog tick.
Now, will a deer tick be on a dog?
Yes, the black-legged tick or deer tick can be on dogs, humans, horses, even birds.
And so what are the most commonly found species here?
Well, we'd have the moose tick, which is on deer and moose. It affects moose quite a bit. We don't find that many people affected picking up moose ticks. We also have the dog tick, which I referred to earlier. Mm-hmm. That tick has, as you look at this slide, there's an ornate pattern on the back of the tick. This is very distinctive, that white showing up, as compared with the black-legged tick, which doesn't have that. The black-legged tick has black legs and is quite dark.
So how do you survey for ticks?
Well, we go out to look for ticks, and we use a flannel material about the size of a flag, and we wave the flag back and forth, or we drag it. So here's an example of dragging a piece of flannel, and the ticks actually are questing. They're looking for a host, and their feet are hanging out from a stem and look for a piece of fabric to hold on to. The other way we use it is waving it back and forth in front of us like a flag, and we do a transect of usually 100 meters, stopping every 10 meters to see what we found. This gives us some idea of the number of ticks per 100 meters, and then we take those ticks and test them for various diseases.
And so I know that too, during hunting season, some tick samples are taken from moose and from deer. Is that another way that you find out what's going on with the population?
We did survey, actually that was the work done by Dr. Trish Hansen. Mm-hmm. She looked for people to pull ticks off deer at the tagging stations, mm-hmm. and that gave us a really good idea of the distribution of moose ticks and deer ticks throughout the state. You
know, some places an animal would come in covered with them, and the next animal would have very few. Is that sort of indicative of how the populations work? I mean, there are heavy populations someplace, not so much in other places?
That's correct. There are, even within a town, there can be some areas where the tick densities are quite high, and other areas where there's practically no ticks at all. What determines really good tick habitat is hard to understand, but sometimes people will be in an area with a high density of ticks but never notice it because they're not in the woods behind their house.
Gotcha. And so how did deer ticks come to be in Vermont anyway? I mean, I know when I moved here 30 years ago, it was unheard of to find ticks.
Well, they weren't here, and that's the mystery that's in front of us. They appeared in southern New England, and this population from southern New England moved westward, northward, and started moving south. At first, researchers thought it was a different species, and then they determined that it was exactly the same species that was in Virginia, but somehow it's able to move quite vigorously throughout New England and is now headed down towards Virginia.
And can survive the harsh winters, which I always thought was, well, if you get a really cold winter, that'll kill off the ticks.
Well, ticks are going to be insulated down in the leaf litter in the woods. So when there's a heavy blanket of snow, that's probably the best way to protect a tick population in sub-zero temperatures. And last winter was a good example of that. We had ample snow, and the snow was here until through April. Mm-hmm.
And so what's the life cycle of a tick?
The life cycle is 2 years, and there's a good picture here that we can look at. It starts with the eggs on the left-hand side, about halfway up. The mm-hmm. eggs hatch in the spring, and they develop into larvae. And tick larvae have 6 legs, which are really different from members of the tick family, which have 8. They look for a host, they look for a small rodent, and they attach to the rodent, they get a blood meal, and they can also, at this time, pick up Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases. They drop off the host, they molt, and they look for another host, and at the end of the season, they turn into a nymph. This would be on the right-hand side of this chart. The nymphs can be infective at this point. They can infect mice, they can infect birds, they can actually infect humans. The nymphs spend the summer growing on a different host. Here's a good example of the different sizes. Larvae are really small. They're about the size of a speck of dust.
Wow.
And the adult females and males are about the size of a sesame seed. And then in fall, the adult tick will emerge about the beginning of October. And that's what I call the beginning of the adult deer tick season. And that will, you can pick up adult deer ticks. Here's a good example of a larva. Notice it's got 6 legs, not 8.
Right.
And then we have a nymph. Here's a nymph that has 8 legs. And then the engorged tick is quite large. It can be the size of a pea.
And that's usually when people find them, right?
People will actually find them crawling on them. And this is probably the best time. If you'll find a bloated tick usually on your pet or horse. People usually notice when there's a bloated tick on them.
And so what's the best way to get rid of a tick if you find that you've got a tick on your body or one that's attached? Just pull it off and throw it away?
What I recommend is using a tool, a fine pair of forceps, or they have tick removers, which are a little tiny fork-like device that allows you to lift the tick off. You don't want to squeeze it. You don't want to use matches, Vaseline, cigarettes. Those don't work. But you want to lift the tick off gently. You want to try to remove it within 24 to 36 hours. And the best thing to do is to preserve it, put it in a little alcohol if you have questions about you wanting to get it identified.
Interesting, and find out if maybe it's got a disease?
We don't recommend testing the ticks because the tick could have a disease, but it was within a time shorter than 36 hours. It's unlikely that the Lyme disease would be transferred.
So how do you prevent getting bitten by a tick?
What we encourage people to do is prevention. And this is really the prevention month of the year, June and July, both for ticks and mosquitoes. Personal protection using repellents, and the CDC has some really great information. You can treat clothing. There's a product called permethrin. It's a synthetic pyrethroid. And you can treat socks, you can treat your trousers, you can treat gaiters. That's what I use. When it's dry, it's totally inert. It'll go through several washings. This is really good for hunters, certainly in October when they're going to be sitting on stone walls and out in the woods.
Right.
But it's also good for people hiking around.
And if you do get bitten, what should you do?
If you do get bitten, remove the tick immediately and talk to your health provider. They will have good information about the risk involved.
And how can people get more information about mosquitoes and ticks?
There's some really good information at the on our website, agriculturevermont.gov. The Vermont Department of Health has an excellent website, both for ticks and mosquitoes. And the Centers for Disease Control has set up an extensive number of pages giving you as much information as you possibly would want.
All right, well, I want to thank you for coming in today and talking about this. And once again, fall is a prime time for ticks, so cover up.
Cover up.
All right, thank you so much. That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.